The armory buzzed with a constant hum, part machinery, part quiet conversation, and part the ambient energy field that lined the ceilings and walls. Dozens of alien soldiers moved about the large room, clad in sleek, high-tech armor that shimmered under the cold blue light. They adjusted their weapons, glossy, compact plasma rifles, ion dischargers, and other energy-based tools of war that looked more like art pieces than instruments of destruction. They came from different corners of the galaxy, each representing a member species of the United Coalition, an interstellar alliance of civilizations that prided itself on military superiority, technological advancement, and elite coordination. And in the middle of all that stood Private James Callahan, the lone representative of Earth. He was a tall man, lean but strong, with sun-weathered skin, short brown hair tucked under a simple military cap, and calm green eyes that had seen just enough war to keep him from flinching in crowds like these. He wore standard Earth combat fatigues, olive drab with a patch that read U.S. Army above his heart. Slung across his chest on a simple nylon strap was the item that had drawn every eye in the room and every sneer: his rifle. It was an M4 carbine, steel and polymer with a slightly scratched matte black finish. No glowing elements, no cooling coils, no humming power cells, just a barrel, a magazine, and a basic iron sight mounted on a Picatinny rail. To the alien soldiers, it may as well have been a museum piece. A soft clicking echoed nearby, followed by a guttural scoff. Zelar, a Qian weapons expert, approached with a contemptuous grin. His tall, insectoid frame towered over most of the room, covered in deep green chitin that gleamed under the lights. His mandibles clicked in amusement as his narrow claws reached out and touched the edge of Callahan's weapon. Snapping underfoot, it looks more like a primitive farming tool. The insult drew immediate laughter from the surrounding crowd, aliens of various shapes, sizes, and colors who had been waiting for their chance to ridicule the human. Maybe it's ceremonial, one snorted in the back, a wide-eyed Rithari whose pale blue skin rippled like mercury. Or perhaps it's a backup tool for digging trenches by hand, chuckled another, a stocky Thalaxian with glowing orange tattoos etched into his plated skin. Callahan said nothing. He'd heard worse. He just stood there, letting the waves of laughter and condescension wash over him. His hand stayed firmly on the rifle's grip and guard, calm and confident. It wasn't the first time he'd been in a room full of skeptics. And it wouldn't be the last. He'd trained for this, not just to fight, but to represent. The Earth military had been offered a symbolic seat at the Coalition's training academy, not out of admiration, but out of courtesy. Politics demanded that every sentient species be given a chance, even the newcomers like humanity. From the moment he stepped off the shuttle and onto the station, Callahan had known he was being sized up and dismissed. Humanity's relatively late arrival onto the galactic stage had been met with raised eyebrows and polite smiles. Earth had no energy weapons, no anti-gravity tanks, no nano-armor or mind-synced targeting systems. Their ships were still hull-based, their vehicles ran on combustion or magnetic drives, and their weapons? Simple, kinetic, chemically fired projectiles. Zeller leaned in closer, still holding the rifle like one might hold a particularly old and useless relic. "Steel?" he asked with a laugh, turning the rifle over in his spindly claws. "You realize that kinetic weapons are a thing of the past, right? We've been using energy-based systems for millennia. Plasma, fusion bolts, zero-point discharges. And you're carrying what? A stick that throws tiny bits of metal." Another wave of laughter erupted, this time louder. Zeller's mandibles twitched in satisfaction. Callahan looked at him and shrugged. "You don't have to like it," he said casually, "but it gets the job done." That line, simple and unfazed, only fed the aliens' amusement. A few slapped their sides. Others translated the joke into their native tongue so their comrades could enjoy it too. There was hooting, clicking, gurgling, and high-pitched trills from a dozen species, all of them laughing at one earthling who clearly hadn't gotten the memo. Energy ruled everything. But beneath their mockery, there was something else too, a subtle air of superiority, as if Earth's presence was more of a novelty than a necessity. The coalition was vast, united, and efficient. Their war doctrines were engineered down to the molecule. They saw humanity as rough-edged, archaic, and overly dependent on brute force. Their weapons didn't need explosions. They relied on precision plasma streams and instantaneous damage, clean and efficient. Earth, on the other hand, had bullets. Yet Callahan stood calmly amid it all, not out of arrogance, but certainty. He knew something they didn't, and deep down, a part of him pitied them for not knowing it yet. "Enough," came a sudden voice from the rear of the room. The laughter died instantly, as though a switch had been flipped. The temperature in the room seemed to dip. Commander Threx had arrived. The towering Dromorian officer stepped forward with the heavy clank of his boots. He was a massive figure, built like a walking wall of scaled armor. His skin shimmered like oil under the lights, and a dark scar traced across one of his 4 eyes. Though stoic by nature, Threx commanded attention wherever he went, and silence followed in his wake. He looked around the room slowly, then turned his intense gaze toward Callahan and Zeller. "Private Callahan," he said, voice deep and razor-sharp, "care to explain your weapons capabilities?" "I'm genuinely curious." Callahan gave the commander a nod, then looked at the room full of skeptics. "This here's an M4 carbine," he began, holding it up as if it were any other tool in a craftsman's belt. "It fires 5.56-45 in NATO rounds. Lightweight, reliable, can go semi-auto or 3-round burst. Max effective range is about 500 meters, give or take." He spoke plainly without flair, just facts. No sales pitch. Zeller made an exaggerated snort, waving a claw. "Compared to our plasma rifles, it's like throwing stones. Our weapons vaporize armor, burn through walls." "Yours, what?" Knocks on the door and asks politely to be let in. There were chuckles again, but they were more subdued now, almost strained. Callahan didn't flinch. "Plasma rifles are definitely powerful," he admitted. "No doubt. But they've got weaknesses: high power consumption, overheating issues, recoil compensation, not to mention energy field interference." Zeller scoffed again. "Excuses. Plasma is the future. It's energy made lethal. What's the point of hurling metal when you can incinerate your enemy with a pulse of light?" Callahan met his eyes, voice steady. "The point is, it works." A silence fell. This time not awkward, but charged. Commander Thrax let the moment hang, then raised one hand. "Let's put this debate to rest," he said. "Field test, now." He gestured toward a thick armored door near the back of the armory. Behind it was the Coalition's state-of-the-art firing range, a place where weapons were tested under combat-like conditions. "Private Callahan," the commander said, stepping aside. "You have the floor." As the other soldiers filed toward the door, their expressions were a mix of amusement, curiosity, and a faint trace of something else: doubt. For the first time, they weren't quite sure what they were about to witness. They had mocked the human's weapon without reservation, but the tone had shifted. There was something about the way Callahan had held himself, something quiet and confident. Callahan followed them with an even stride, his rifle hanging comfortably against his chest. His boots echoed softly on the metal floor, and though the room buzzed with quiet conversation in a dozen alien tongues, none of it fazed him. He didn't feel like he was walking into a trap or a joke. He felt like he was walking into a lesson, and they were all about to learn something. The firing range door slid open with a low hiss. revealing a vast chamber lined with reinforced walls that bore the scars of countless drills and live fire exercises. The space stretched nearly the length of a football field, and the air carried the faint metallic tang of scorched metal and ionized particles. The walls were pockmarked with old plasma scorch marks, deep furrows from particle beams, and the occasional blast crater where high-yield rounds had detonated during tests. This was a place designed to endure and to humble. Callahan stepped through the doorway, his boots transitioning from smooth metal floors to the dense, shock-absorbent polymer of the range. He felt the familiar pull of discipline tighten in his chest, the kind he'd trained under back on Earth. Everything slowed down just a little. He was back in his element. Behind him came the shuffle and scuttle of alien feet, some soft and quick, others heavy and deliberate. The soldiers gathered along the observation area behind the ballistic shield, Zealer among them, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with smug expectation. Some of them still whispered in their native tongues, tossing quick glances toward the lone human who dared bring a relic into approving ground. Commander Threx stepped forward, his voice echoing crisply through the range's intercom system. "Private Callahan, begin demonstration. Standard targets. No restrictions." "Copy that," Callahan said. Adjusting his rifle strap, he moved toward the designated firing lane. Ahead, several hardened metal targets stood spaced at varying distances, some shaped like humanoid torsos, others bulkier to simulate armored threats. Above them, small drones hovered, ready to record impact, penetration, and damage analytics. Callahan pulled the charging handle back, chambering the first round. The sharp metallic clack was small compared to the hums and whines of the Coalition's energy-based weaponry, but it felt good in his hands. Familiar, real. He flipped off the safety and squared his stance. Breathe in, hold, squeeze. The shot cracked through the air like a whip. A single brass casing ejected with a sharp clink as the bullet streaked downrange and struck the nearest target with a loud metallic clang. The projectile tore through the steel with clean precision, leaving a small, smoldering hole in its center. The target rocked slightly on its mount, then stabilized. There was a pause, a breath of silence, then murmuring. Some of the alien soldiers leaned forward. Others blinked, mandibles twitching or eyes narrowing, trying to register what they had just seen. A projectile weapon had just punched a hole through high-grade target steel that had taken glancing plasma hits without so much as flinching. Zealer's expression shifted from amusement to tight-lipped confusion. "Well," he muttered, voice thick with reluctant acknowledgement. "It can punch through metal. I'll give you that." Commander Threx didn't say anything. He merely gave a nod and gestured again. Try the shielded target. Now it was time for the real test. Callahan shifted slightly, zeroing in on a new target farther down the range, this one encased in a soft shimmer, a distortion in the air like heat waves rising off asphalt. Coalition standard energy shielding, designed to deflect or dissipate high-energy attacks, particularly plasma and ion bursts. The pride of the Union's defensive systems. Callahan exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger again. Crack. The rifle recoiled smoothly against his shoulder. The round zipped across the range and passed through the shimmering energy field without resistance. A split second later, the target behind it rang with a hard metallic thud. A dent bloomed in the surface of the target, just behind the flickering remnants of the shield. The room fell into stunned silence. It hadn't ricocheted. It hadn't vaporized. It hadn't even slowed down. It had gone right through. The energy field rippled faintly, as if embarrassed by its own failure to do its job. One of the technicians looked down at their tablet, tapped something, then tapped it again harder, clearly double-checking the telemetry. Callahan lowered his rifle slowly. "Physical projectiles," he said, loud enough for the front row of alien observers to hear, "aren't affected by dispersion fields the same way plasma or beam energy is." Your shields are built to block light and energy, not physics. Zealer's mandibles twitched again. He took an unconscious step forward, the confidence in his tone beginning to falter. But that's just brute force, he protested. It's primitive. There's no finesse, Callahan shrugged again, calm as ever. Maybe, but it works. And in a firefight, that's what counts. Threx was silent, still watching the range. His arms were crossed, but his eyes tracked every movement, every reaction. He hadn't voiced his opinion yet, and that made the silence more powerful than any laughter. Callahan could feel the room's energy shift. The mockery was gone now, replaced with curiosity, maybe even unease. These soldiers had come expecting a show. What they got instead was a quiet revelation, one shot at a time. Threx finally turned and gave a new order. Prepare moving targets, standard evasive protocol, maximum difficulty. There was a brief pause, then one of the technicians confirmed, acknowledged. Targets loaded. In an instant, new simulations appeared, downrange holographic threats layered with real-time movement projection. Each had integrated energy shields and advanced AI flight paths that caused them to dart and weave unpredictably, mimicking fast-moving enemies. They shifted side to side, jumped elevations, even disappeared behind barriers before re-emerging somewhere else. This was a test the aliens used regularly, specifically designed for plasma and beam weapons with advanced tracking systems. The average Coalition soldier could complete the course in under 30 seconds with a multi-lock plasma rifle. Zeller folded his arms again, grasping at a shred of superiority. Let's see how your little toy handles speed. Those targets aren't just standing still anymore. Plasma tracks movement and adjusts instantly. Can your bullets catch what they can't lock onto? Callahan just nodded. Let's find out. He adjusted his sights slightly, flipping to the 3-round burst setting, and reset his stance. It was nothing flashy, no gliding footwork, no AI-assisted shoulder mount, no biometrics enhanced reflex enhancer. Just decades of Earthside marksmanship discipline, honed through generations of training and war. On my mark, Threx said, voice clear through the comm. 3, 2, 1. Mark. The range came alive. Targets zipped across lanes, disappearing and reappearing, darting in and out of cover. Shields flared with every simulated evasive maneuver. It was chaos calculated, controlled chaos designed to overwhelm. But Callahan didn't flinch. His breathing slowed. His grip stayed steady, and then he fired. Crack, 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 crack. Pause, crack, crack. The Morse spoke in rhythm, like a drummer calling out to war. The sound was sharp, brutal, almost jarring in a room that usually echoed with the smooth, quiet thrum of plasma weapons. But it wasn't the sound that stunned the observers. It was the hits, one by one. The targets dropped. Each time a simulated enemy paused or turned, Callahan fired, and each time a bullet passed through the shield and struck true. Some targets flickered and vanished immediately, their hitboxes overwhelmed. Others reeled from the impact and continued momentarily before a second or third round found its mark. He moved with controlled precision, not wasting shots, not showing off, just efficient, brutal accuracy, reflex, focus, experience. Behind him, the aliens stopped whispering. They were watching, really watching. Zealer's mandibles had stopped twitching. His arms were still folded, but his fingers dug into his own elbows now. His jaw clenched tighter with each impact. How? He wanted to ask, but the answer came before he could speak. Practice, Callahan said, his voice calm as ever, even as his eyes stayed locked on the range. We train with moving targets all the time. You don't need energy systems for that. You just need timing and aim. The final target zipped behind a barrier, then popped up a split second later. Crack. The bullet hit center mass. The shield flickered and died. The target fell. The range powered down slowly, the lights dimming as the simulation ended. The silence returned, but now it was a different kind of silence. It was reverence. Threx stepped forward from the observation deck, walking down the steps and onto the range floor. His expression was unreadable, his scaled face betraying nothing, but his movements had shifted. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was evaluating. "Your weapon performs admirably in combat conditions," he finally said, his tone low but sincere. "I did not expect such precision, nor such consistent engagement at high speed." Callahan lowered his rifle. "Appreciate it, sir." Zelor, standing just behind Threx, tried once more to find an edge. "But your weapon still lacks destructive power," he blurted, almost desperately. "Sure, it can hit targets even through shields, but a single plasma bolt can vaporize a section of hull. Yours just dents and punches." Callahan gave him a glance, then nodded slightly. "Plasma is powerful, I won't argue, but with power comes trade-offs. Energy drain, heat buildup. And if you miss, you waste an expensive charge." Threx tilted his head, considering the words. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "we should test destructive potential as well." The words weren't a suggestion. They were a challenge, and Callahan was ready. The last target had barely cooled when the next phase was already set into motion. Commander Threx turned to the control booth and gave a sharp gesture. His voice was calm, but it carried that undertone of anticipation, like a seasoned predator catching the scent of something unexpected. "Deploy the armored target," he said. There was a low rumble beneath the floor, a deep mechanical vibration that seemed to reach up through the soles of their boots. A moment later, a rectangular slab began to rise from the center of the range floor. Thick, broad, menacing, covered in multiple layers of dull gray plating, reinforced at the seams with ridged shielding braces. The exterior was slightly scuffed from previous tests, but otherwise intact, untouched by anything short of high explosive plasma charges. Callahan eyed the target and knew immediately what he was looking at. "That thing's a tank," he muttered under his breath, and it was, not a literal tank, but close enough. It was the Coalition's standard for high-yield destructive testing. A dense block of military-grade alloy engineered to simulate the hull plating of heavy interstellar carriers or battlefield bunkers. It had stopped ion beams. It had endured fusion torpedoes. Most energy weapons didn't even leave a scratch. Callahan tightened his grip on his rifle, mentally reviewing what he had in his kit. Standard rounds wouldn't cut it here, not with that kind of plating. He reached into one of the pouches on his vest and pulled out a matte black magazine, slightly heavier than the others, sleek, with red markings stenciled along the side, a symbol denoting its contents, armor piercing. He gave it a quick inspection, then slotted it into the magwell with a clean click. From another pouch, he withdrew a short, stubby cylindrical attachment and screwed it onto the rifle's muzzle with practiced ease. Zeller squinted at the gear. "What is that? A compensator? Suppressor? What difference will it make? That wall eats plasma for breakfast." Callahan didn't answer him. He was focused now, locked in. "Threx, ever the observer," asked quietly. "That standard issue?" Callahan nodded. "Suppressor's field grade, reduces flash and recoil, helps keep the shooter stable. The ammo's specialized, tungsten core, steel jacket, armor-piercing tip, designed to punch through engine blocks and reinforce vehicle armor back on Earth." Zelor laughed aloud, disbelief spilling from his voice. "Tungsten? You think a piece of rock and metal is going to crack that?" Callahan didn't even look his way. "Don't need to believe it," he said. "Just watch." He stepped up to the firing line. The target loomed in front of him like a monolith, cold and unmoving. From behind the glass partition, a dozen alien eyes tracked his every motion. Some arms were crossed. Others held datapads, already logging the test results in real time. Skepticism still hung in the air, but it was no longer the dominant force. Now there was something else. Curiosity, tension, a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, something was about to challenge their expectations. Callahan took a breath, lined up his sights. The world narrowed. In that moment, it didn't matter that he was surrounded by a room full of aliens with weapons that could light up a battlefield like a second sun. It didn't matter that his rifle was mocked as a relic or that his tactics were viewed as outdated. Right now, it was him, the rifle, the trigger, the target. He squeezed. The shot rang out like a hammer striking steel, louder and deeper than the previous bursts. The armor-piercing round tore through the air, its velocity a blur, invisible to the naked eye. There was no explosion, no flash of light, just a heavy thunk, a low-impact sound that reverberated across the chamber. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then faintly, a crack began to form on the surface of the armored target. A subtle line, just below where the round had hit. Zealer started to chuckle, mandibles parting in smug satisfaction. That's it? One shot, and the rest of his words died in his throat. The crack widened. A jagged piece of the outer layer split from the slab and clattered to the ground, exposing a gash in the alloy beneath, deep, rough, and unmistakably the result of physical force. The murmuring began again, this time louder. Disbelief, surprise, and beneath that the spark of realization. This wasn't a gimmick. It wasn't trickery. Callahan had cracked the uncrackable. Threx stepped forward slowly, eyes narrowing as he studied the exposed damage. The other officers crowded around the screen feeds, cycling through slow-motion replays and structural scans. Callahan lowered his rifle, calm and composed. "Small caliber," he said, his voice filling the stillness. "But when you pack enough velocity and mass, it doesn't matter. That's what kinetic weapons do. No energy signature, no particle dispersion. Just raw force." Zealer was silent now. The confident glint in his eyes was gone. He looked between Callahan and the fractured target, then back again, as if trying to reconcile the two. "That shouldn't be possible," he muttered. "We've fired plasma lances at that wall. They scorched the surface. Your bullet broke it." Callahan didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or raise his voice. He simply stepped aside, ejected the magazine, and let the faint warmth of the rifle fade from his gloved hands. "It's not about being flashy," he said. "It's about understanding the limits, knowing the material, working with physics instead of trying to outsmart it." Threx approached the slab, his massive hand running along the damaged site. His touch was gentle despite his size, fingers tracing the path the round had taken. He examined the stress fractures forming around the gash, telltale signs of deeper structural failure. "You engineered a projectile to defeat our defenses," he said, almost to himself. "Not engineered," Callahan replied, "just refined. Earth's had to deal with tanks, bunkers, fortifications. We didn't have energy weapons, so we pushed ballistic science as far as it could go. Every round is a lesson in materials, velocity, and force." There was a long pause. Then, Threx nodded slowly. "And you brought that lesson to us." Callahan nodded back, not to impress, just to survive. A strange quiet followed. Even Zealer had gone still, his arms hanging slightly at his sides, eyes darting between the screen and the human soldier who had just rewritten their assumptions with a bullet in a barrel. Threx turned toward the others. "This," he said, his voice commanding but calm, "is the value of perspective. We believed our technology had made us invulnerable, that energy weapons had eclipsed all else. But we forgot the fundamentals." He looked directly at Callahan. "We forgot what a well-placed shot can do." Callahan gave a slow nod. "In Earth wars, sometimes it's not the biggest weapon that wins. It's the one that fits the job." One of the younger soldiers, an avian species with feathered arms and high-frequency vocalization, tilted his head. "So, does this mean your weapons are better?" Callahan smiled faintly. "Not better. Just different. Our tech isn't as advanced, sure. But it's versatile. reliable, easier to maintain in the field. You don't need a charging station or a plasma cell to make a bullet go where it needs to go. Zeller finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. You planned this. Callahan met his gaze evenly. We didn't plan to prove anything. We just planned to be ready. That landed heavier than any shot fired that day. The aliens, so used to simulations, to predictive combat protocols, and AI-assisted tactics, were forced to reckon with something they hadn't accounted for. Resilience, grit, simplicity turned lethal by necessity. Threx looked around the chamber, his expression hardening not in anger, but in sober reflection. This demonstration will be reviewed by every command level in the Coalition, he said, and our training protocols will be adjusted accordingly. He faced Callahan directly. You've given us more than a demonstration. You've given us a reminder. Callahan shrugged modestly. Just doing my job, Commander. No, Threx said. You're doing far more than that. The other soldiers began to stir. Some approached quietly, peering at the rifle, murmuring among themselves. A few asked questions. One or two even requested to hold the weapon, to feel its weight. And Zeller, he stood still for a long while, then looked at Callahan once more. There was still pride in his posture, but now it was mixed with something deeper. Respect, perhaps, he said slowly. We've underestimated more than just your weapons. Callahan gave a small nod. We all do it sometimes. As the group began to disperse, Threx lingered for a moment longer. Then he offered a hand. Thank you, Private. Callahan shook it firmly. We're glad to be here, sir. The doors to the range slid open again, and the group filtered out, some still talking quietly, others deep in thought. But the energy had changed. Something fundamental had shifted. Today hadn't been about Earth proving superiority. It had been about reminding the galaxy that sometimes the basics still worked. That sometimes, when everything else failed, a man with a rifle and a little patience could still change the game. The echo of the last gunshot hadn't yet faded from the walls when the real impact of the demonstration began to settle in. The firing range emptied slowly, like the tide retreating after a storm, leaving behind the silence of thoughts unspoken. Where there had once been arrogance and mockery, now there was only reflection. Private James Callahan remained by the firing line for a few moments longer. The heavy slab of armor still stood in front of him, fractured but upright, a wounded monument to the truth he brought with him. He gazed at the cracked surface, watching how the jagged line of impact glinted under the harsh range lights. In a room built for futuristic weapons, one steel-cored bullet had carved a lesson deeper than plasma ever could. He slung the M4 back over his shoulder, double-checked the safety, and began walking toward the exit. As he passed the thick glass of the observation booth, several alien technicians tracked him with their eyes, saying nothing. They didn't have to. Their silence was weighted, respectful, puzzled, maybe even a little humbled. Back in the adjacent corridor, Commander Threx stood waiting, arms crossed, his thick scaled tail coiled low around his boots. He gave Callahan a slight nod, not the kind handed out for protocol or show, but one soldier to another. Impressive work, Private, Threx said. I believe your demonstration exceeded expectations. Callahan returned the nod. Wasn't trying to make a statement, sir. Just wanted to show what we could do. You did more than that, the commander replied, turning to walk beside him. You made the entire coalition stop and think. They walked down the long corridor that connected the range to the strategic planning chambers. The walls here were lined with digital displays showing tactical simulations, ongoing battlefield analytics, and archive footage of past exercises. Callahan caught glimpses of familiar faces and unfamiliar terrain, coalition campaigns he'd never seen firsthand, but now might be part of. As they walked, more officers began to appear, various species and ranks, all wearing the crisp insignia of their commands. Some offered glances in his direction. Others paused their conversations as he passed. not out of malice or suspicion, just uncertainty. The kind that came when deeply rooted beliefs were suddenly shaken. They entered the war room. The chamber was massive, circular, and dimly lit, except for a large holographic display in the center. Images of the armor test were already cycling across the space, slow-motion replays of Callahan's shots, angle breakdowns, velocity overlays. Every detail was being examined. Around the table stood the Coalition's senior tactical leaders, representatives from a dozen species, high-ranking strategists, field commanders, logistics engineers. Threx took his place at the head and gestured for Callahan to stand at his side. One of the senior officers, a tall robed Tevran named Vishal, cleared his throat, his voice like wind over hollow stone. We have all reviewed the footage. We've seen the data. I will not dispute the effectiveness of the human weapon demonstrated here today. There were nods from several others. A few folded their arms. One or two said nothing, their expressions unreadable. But Vishal continued. The larger question remains. Does this justify a re-evaluation of our weapons doctrine? Another officer, a lithe Zarathi female named Commander Linnea, tapped the console in front of her. A hologram of the M4 appeared, rotating slowly, its internal mechanisms labeled in glowing alien script. This design is centuries old by human standards, she said. It lacks modular energy coupling, anti-recoil dampeners, AI-assisted targeting. By our definitions, it is primitive. And yet, Threx interrupted, it pierced a reinforced armor block engineered to withstand our heaviest plasma ordnance. Linnea inclined her head, conceding the point. Yes, it did. Zeeler stood near the back of the room, arms folded tight across his chest, his expression a mix of frustration and reluctant understanding. He hadn't spoken yet, but his silence spoke volumes. Callahan stood quiet while they debated, letting the moment unfold. Another officer, a Drellorian tactician named Sirac, raised a long, bony finger. We must be careful. One demonstration does not undermine an entire combat doctrine. Plasma remains dominant for a reason: speed, versatility, overwhelming power. Are we to throw that away? No one is suggesting we abandon plasma, Threx said, his voice calm but resolute. But it's clear we've neglected a category of weaponry that still holds relevance. That could be a strategic oversight. Callahan finally spoke, stepping forward slightly. If I may, Commander? Threx nodded. Go ahead. Callahan turned to face the council, his voice steady but never confrontational. Your technology is incredible. No doubt about that. Plasma weapons are powerful. Your energy shields are brilliant. I've seen things here we couldn't dream of on Earth, but sometimes power isn't enough. He paced slowly, hands behind his back. You've optimized for your strengths. You've built doctrines around control, precision, overwhelming firepower. But that optimization comes at a cost: adaptability. He paused, letting the word sink in. Humans grew up on a world that never played fair. We didn't have the luxury of high-energy resources or perfect environmental control. We fought wars in jungles, deserts, frozen tundras, crumbling cities. We made weapons that didn't need to be charged or synced or cooled. We made weapons that worked in the mud, the sand, the snow, in the middle of nowhere without backup. He unslung the M4 and held it up. This rifle is simple. It's rugged. It can be cleaned with a rag and a toothbrush. It can be dropped, dunked, dragged through dirt, and it still fires, because that's what we needed. Something that didn't break when everything else did. Vishal raised a brow writ. You argue for simplicity. I argue for balance, Callahan corrected. You don't have to trade one for the other. You can have both. But right now, you're missing half the toolbox. That got murmurs of agreement from a few of the younger commanders. One even leaned forward to examine the rifle projection more closely. Zaylor finally spoke, his voice quiet, but with a hint of bitterness. You say your weapons survive, but ours dominate. Our plasma rifles can level structures. Yours pokes holes. Callahan met his gaze. Sure, but what happens when your rifle overheats? What happens when your power cell fails mid-battle? What happens when you run out of charge and all you've got is a paperweight with a trigger? Zeller didn't respond. We fought those battles, Callahan continued. We've learned the hard way that having something simple and reliable often makes the difference between walking away or not. A deep silence settled over the room. Then Threx turned to the council. I propose we add ballistic and kinetic training modules to our cross-species combat curriculum, not as replacements but as supplements. Every soldier should know the strengths and weaknesses of every tool at our disposal. There were murmurs, a few nods, some frowns, but no one outright disagreed. Callahan stood back, watching it unfold. He wasn't here to demand change, just to offer a window. And for the first time since he arrived, he could see that window opening. Vishal finally turned toward him. His voice was less stern now, measured. Private Callahan. Thank you. You have reminded us that progress is not always linear. Sometimes wisdom lies in what is old. Callahan gave a slight bow of his head. We're just here to pull our weight. As the meeting adjourned, several officers stayed behind, chatting more intently about kinetic models, field tests, hybrid applications. Others approached Callahan with questions about ammunition types, maintenance schedules, performance in zero gravity. He answered each one patiently. Even Zeller lingered nearby, watching with a conflicted look. Eventually, he approached. He didn't offer an apology, but he didn't offer a scoff either. You may not be as primitive as I thought, he said gruffly. Callahan smiled faintly. We get that a lot. Zeller looked at the M4 once more, then back to Callahan. Perhaps we've been refining our weapons so much we forgot how to make them. Endure, Callahan nodded. You build masterpieces. We build hammers. But sometimes all you need is a hammer. And with that, they parted ways. Later that night, Callahan sat alone in the small bunk assigned to him. The room was stark, with metallic walls and a dim reading light casting a soft glow over the datapad in his hand. He reviewed the logs from the day, the ballistics reports, the footage, the scan data. Every metric supported what he already knew. But what mattered more were the faces, the ones who had laughed. Now they listened. He set the datapad down, leaned back against the cool metal wall, and closed his eyes for a moment. Somewhere down the corridor he could still hear quiet conversations, murmured voices. The start of something new. Maybe it would take time. Maybe the Coalition wouldn't replace their plasma rifles with M4s anyway. Time soon. But the door had opened. And that, he thought, was enough. 2 standard weeks had passed since Private Callahan's impromptu demonstration rewrote centuries of Coalition combat assumptions. In the grand halls of the Central Command Academy, where doctrine had been etched in holoscripts and simulation for decades, change was now echoing through the corridors. The shift wasn't loud. It wasn't broadcast across the galaxy or etched into monuments. It began in whispers, quiet discussions between officers and instructors. It spread from war rooms to training fields, from theory to practice, and it was felt most strongly in the place that mattered most. The training grounds. On the wide expanse of range Delta 17, a sun-scorched flatland fitted with modular terrain generators and dynamic weather filters, a new exercise was being run. One not based on plasma projections or energy grid management. There were no humming rifles or glowing coils. Instead, the air was filled with sharp, percussive cracks that echoed like thunder across the terrain. Callahan stood near the edge of the field, arms crossed, watching with a faint grin as 3 alien cadets crouched behind cover and carefully took aim. One was a Rithari. Her sleek blue form crouched low to the ground, long fingers delicately adjusting the iron sights on an Earth-made training rifle. The second was a bulky Gurnak, his thick hands gripping the weapon like it might break if he didn't restrain himself. His breathing was heavy but steady, focused. The third was perhaps the most unexpected, a young Thulaxian officer, normally more comfortable issuing commands than holding a rifle, now squinting one eye as he lined up a shot with shaky resolve. "Remember," Callahan called out, his voice calm and even, "don't snatch the trigger. Squeeze it, let the shot surprise you." The Thulaxian fired. The rifle kicked back in his arms, the round striking just low of the target. Not a hit, but not a bad miss either. The alien lowered the weapon and looked over to Callahan. "Why is it that the shot must surprises me?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Would it not be more effective to anticipate it?" Callahan stepped forward and knelt beside him. He picked up the spent casing, letting it roll between his fingers before answering. "When you anticipate the shot," he said, "you tend to jerk the rifle, flinch, tense up. That throws your aim. But if you're focused on breathing, sight alignment, trigger control, when the shot goes off, you stay still. That's how you stay accurate." The Thulaxian gave a slow nod, absorbing the lesson. None of these cadets had held a firearm like this 2 weeks ago. Now, each of them was learning the feel of recoil, the scent of propellant, the rhythm of working a bolt or swapping a magazine. Not out of nostalgia, but because their instructors had been told, firmly and from the top down, that adaptability was now mission critical. And the first to deliver that message, Commander Threx. After the War Council meeting, he had personally ordered the Coalition's Officer Academy to begin integrating a supplemental ballistic program. Initially, it had been framed as cross-weapon familiarization, a neutral term to keep the traditionalists calm. But the intent was clear. Learn what Earth knew. Train like Earth trained. At first, there had been resistance. Some instructors saw it as a regression. Some called it unnecessary, a distraction from their superior systems. But others saw what Threx had seen that day on the range, how the human rifle had carved through shield and armor, how Callahan's calm focus had turned simplicity into lethality. And so the training began. Callahan had been requested as a liaison instructor, not because he held rank or seniority, but because he had demonstrated without arrogance or bravado what those weapons could do in the right hands. He wasn't here to lecture. He was here to help, and help he did. Each morning, he met with a new group of cadets. Some came willingly, some came reluctantly, but all of them eventually came to understand. "Why does it kick?" one asked, rubbing his shoulder after his first shot. "Because physics," Callahan answered with a grin. "Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. When you throw a tiny piece of metal really fast out of one end, the rest of the gun wants to jump the other way." Another cadet tilted his head. "Our plasma weapons have recoil dampeners. Should we not install them here?" "You could," Callahan said, "but it would change the balance of the weapon. Part of the skill is learning how to work with the recoil, not against it." By the end of their first week, the cadets had learned to disassemble and reassemble the M4 in under 2 minutes. They could load magazines blindfolded. They could field strip the weapon in simulated dust storms, artificial mud, zero-G, and extreme heat. They'd started to understand not just how to fire the rifle, but why it mattered. Callahan made sure they understood the bigger picture too. "It's not about replacing what you've got," he told one class. "Your plasma rifles are amazing for the environments they were built for: urban ops, space corridors, clean energy supply lines. But what happens when the power grid gets knocked out? What happens when your rifle shorts during a magnetic storm, and all you've got left is your sidearm and whatever you can scrounge from the terrain?" A silence would usually follow. "You use what works," he said. The cadets were starting to get it. One day, while calibrating the range for a moving target drill, Callahan noticed something unexpected: a new shipment of materials being unloaded at the logistics depot nearby. Crates, all marked with the Coalition's standardized symbols for experimental, live fire, and approved by command. He walked over, curious. Inside were Leaka's perfectly forged copies of Earth kinetic rifles, pistols, bolt actions, and even old-style shotguns. Not just M4s now, they were scaling the program. A technician, noticing his interest, approached him. "We've had dozens of requests from outposts to begin integrating these into their combat readiness kits," she explained. Apparently, Commander Threx signed off on it personally. Callahan blinked, slightly surprised. "Didn't think it'd catch on this fast." She smiled. "Turns out versatility's contagious. Even the war games had started to change." Simulated combat zones now included dead zones, areas where energy weapons were disabled by interference, forcing soldiers to switch to kinetic gear. Teams that had previously dominated with plasma rifles had to rethink everything. Cover mattered again, shot placement mattered again, ammo count mattered again. And in those environments, the human-designed weapons thrived. At one point, a team of mixed-species cadets ran a gauntlet using only Earth firearms. They completed it faster and with fewer simulated casualties than any team had in the past 3 months. That footage was reviewed over and over again, replayed in command briefings, tactical analysis sessions, and even a few recruitment broadcasts. Back in the barracks, Callahan sat with 2 of the Thulaxian officers who had led that team. They shared a meal of ration bars and rehydrated protein packs, their bodies still sore from the day's drills. "You know," one of them said, rubbing his wrist, "I never thought I'd be proud of firing something without a power cell." Callahan chuckled. "It's not the tool, it's how you use it." The other officer nodded. "Still, there's something raw about it. Every shot feels earned. That's how it's supposed to feel," Callahan said, finishing his bar. "The weapon doesn't do the work you do." Later that evening, he stood alone by the outdoor training yard. Stars stretched above the horizon, unfamiliar constellations blinking across the night sky. This was still alien land, still foreign territory, but it didn't feel so distant anymore. He thought back to the first day he'd stepped into the armory. The laughter, the scorn, the way they'd mocked his weapon, his world. And now they were training with it. Now they were learning from it. Maybe humanity hadn't brought the most advanced technology into the Coalition, but they had brought something just as valuable, perspective, and it was spreading. The door behind him opened. Threx stepped out, arms behind his back, eyes also cast upward at the night sky. "You've made quite the impression, Private," he said. Callahan shrugged. "Didn't do it alone. The rifle helped." Threx let out a deep, amused breath, his species equivalent of a chuckle. "There's talk of a new joint initiative," he continued. "A hybrid combat doctrine. Energy and kinetic integrated, Earth methods combined with Coalition tactics." Callahan raised an eyebrow. "That official?" "Not yet," Threx replied. "But it will be, soon." They stood in silence for a few moments longer. "You've taught us that war isn't just about firepower," Threx said. "It's about readiness, versatility, the ability to adapt when your back's against the wall." Callahan smiled. "Welcome to humanity's wheelhouse." A month had passed. Not a long time in galactic terms. Barely a blink in the life cycles of most Coalition civilizations. But on the training stations orbiting Ursa Prime, it had been enough to witness a quiet revolution. The ripple effects of that single demonstration, one soldier, one rifle, had spread faster than anyone expected. It started with whispers in war rooms, memos exchanged across strategic networks. But then it grew into policy. By week 2, ballistic training had been formally incorporated into 4 separate military academies. By week 3, supply chains had been modified to accommodate low-maintenance, high-durability weapons, many of them inspired directly by Earth's own designs. By week 4, elite units began requesting joint exercise briefings with human operators, not out of obligation or diplomacy, out of respect. And still, through it all, Private James Callahan stayed humble. He trained, he taught, and more than anything, he watched. He watched the way officers now spoke differently, in briefings less concerned with complexity, more concerned with reliability. He saw alien engineers hunched over prototypes of bolt-action rifles, reverse engineering the concept of simple lethality with childlike fascination. He even spotted a senior coalition tactician quoting Earth military doctrine during a live briefing. In the absence of advantage, adaptation becomes supremacy. Callahan smiled when he heard that. It wasn't an Earth quote, not officially, but it might as well have been. That morning, he stood at the edge of the primary training compound, overlooking a new simulation course. The terrain was rough, a mix of steep hills, artificial foliage, mock ruins, and hard angles. This wasn't a clean, polished simulation like the old energy-based combat drills. This was designed to be unpredictable, dirty, real, just the way Earth liked it. Out in the field, a mixed unit of Coalition cadets advanced through the zone, using both plasma and kinetic weapons side by side. Some of them moved like they always had, precise, formation-bound. Others adopted more fluid, adaptive stances, ducking, flanking, adjusting their aim based on recoil rather than charge tracking. And in the center of it all, for the first time, no one looked out of place. No one was laughing. A familiar voice crackled in Callahan's earpiece. Commander Threx to Private Callahan. You copy? Callahan tapped his comm. Go ahead, sir. We're getting requests from 6 outposts to send Earth instructors. Tactical staff want first-hand input on integrating human combat philosophy. Callahan raised a brow. That's a first. It won't be the last, Threx replied. Word's getting out. You've made a lot of believers. Callahan took a slow breath. We didn't set out to change the galaxy, just show what we could do. And that's why it's working, Threx said. You didn't force this on us. You reminded us. There's a difference. He signed off, leaving Callahan alone again, watching a drill team practice suppressive fire using both a plasma repeater and an Earth-manufactured Nu 240. It was loud. It was chaotic. It was beautiful. That night, he found himself alone in the armory, the same room where it all began. The same steel walls, the same energy hum, but it didn't feel the same. He glanced around the racks. Plasma rifles still lined one side, glistening with chrome and charged coils. But now, beside them, sat rows of matte black carbines, shotguns, even crude but durable bolt actions. Some were Coalition-crafted replicas. Others had been imported directly from Earth. It was surreal. Once, this place had claffed at the idea of bullets. Now it stored them. He reached out and picked up one of the newer M4s, identical to his own but cleaner. Factory fresh, still unfamiliar. He checked the chamber out of habit. Clean, lubbed, ready. His fingers settled on the grip, and he realized something odd. The Coalition hadn't just accepted the rifle. They had respected it. That hit harder than any round he'd ever fired. And it wasn't just about the weapon. It was about the idea behind it, the philosophy. The lesson: you didn't need to dazzle your enemy to defeat them. You didn't need to depend on technology so advanced that failure became fatal. Sometimes, the best tools were the ones you could fix in the field with a screwdriver and a little grit. Sometimes, a weapon didn't need to think for you. It needed to be an extension of what you already knew, what you trained, drilled, and internalized over years of hardship and struggle. Earth had been through centuries of war before it ever looked up to the stars. Humanity's history was written in blood, sweat, and innovation born out of desperation. From the trenches of Verdun to the jungles of Vietnam, from the deserts of Iraq to the cities of Berlin, humans had learned again and again that survival belonged not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. That's what the Coalition had forgotten, and that's what they had just rediscovered. Later that week, the Coalition issued an internal bulletin to its senior military leadership. It was a simple message, brief and direct, translated into dozens of languages. Versatility is not a weakness. It is the highest form of strength. The bulletin was attached to a recorded clip. It was Callahan's first shot from the range. The one that started everything. One bullet, one hole in reinforced armor, one reminder. Back on Earth, the message sparked its own quiet pride. News of the demonstration eventually reached military circles, then filtered through civilian networks. Soldiers from all over the planet, veterans and recruits alike, watched the footage with a knowing smile. They understood. They'd always understood. And maybe, for the first time in history, Earth wasn't just catching up to the stars. It was leading. A message in metal. What made that moment so powerful, so transformative, wasn't the weapon. It wasn't the steel or the muzzle flash or the velocity. It was the idea that simplicity, when wielded with discipline, could humble complexity. It was the understanding that being underestimated was a tactical advantage. That in a galaxy obsessed with perfection, humanity had found strength in being imperfect, flexible, and relentlessly determined. And perhaps that's the real lesson, not just for soldiers but for all of us. In our world, we chase innovation like it's the only path forward. We design complex systems, layer them with features, trust them to solve our problems. But sometimes, just sometimes, the simplest solution still works best. A pencil, a hammer, a handshake, a well-timed word, a rifle with iron sights, in the hands of someone who trained hard enough to hit the target when it mattered most. Callahan never wrote a memoir, never gave a speech. He didn't want medals or monuments. But for the soldiers who watched him that day, for the engineers who redesigned their weapons, for the officers who rewrote their doctrines, his legacy endured. They didn't remember the model number of the rifle. They remembered what it meant, that sometimes, when everything else breaks, a well-placed shot still tells the loudest truth.